I'm going to throw in one that doesn't sound like a capacity issue, but it ultimately leads to capacity issue problems and is the root of a lot of badly executed refusals, and that's poor assessments. What leads to a lot of the stuff when you talk to providers about their refusals and you say, hey, this patient shouldn't have signed a refusal, in a lot of cases, the assessment's not very thorough and is not done well enough to determine what the patient's potential clinical problems are. And if you can't determine what their potential clinical problems are, how can you advise them of the risks of refusing transport?
Welcome to In Service, the EMS podcast, where frontline experience meets leadership insight. Hosted by Jason Falvey, a seasoned paramedic and EMS leader with over 30 years in the field. This show brings you conversations with people shaping emergency medical services today. From street-level medics to innovators on the bleeding edge of EMS, we dive into real stories, leadership strategies, and what it takes to build high-performing teams in high-stakes environments. Let's get in service.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Today we're sitting down with Paul Girard. He is one of the most respected voices in EMS risk management, clinical decision-making, and paramedic defense. He's a veteran medic and an EMS educator, nationally recognized for his work in high-risk areas like patient refusals, documentation, and judgment calls made under pressure. Through Paul Girard and Associates, Paul works with EMS agencies across the country, helping them reduce risk, improve documentation, and build systems that protect both patients and providers. For decades, he has reviewed cases where EMS careers were on the line, often coming down to a single decision or how a moment was documented. He's also the host of Inside EMS, Risk Management Podcast, where he breaks down real cases and hard lessons to help EMS professionals slow down, think critically, and understand the real-world consequences of the choices they make in the field. Let's get into it. All right. Welcome. Good afternoon, Paul. How are you?
Good afternoon, Jason. I'm doing well.
Hey, thank you for joining me here today. And today we're going to be talking about the most dangerous decision a paramedic can make. And you are one of the most respected voices in EMS when it comes to quality assurance, quality improvement, EMS risk management, clinical decision-making, and you do medic defense also.
We do as part of our practice. I'm not a lawyer, but we get calls from lawyers to help out when they have cases, reviewing case reviews, doing expert witness testimony, and that sort of thing.
Right. So tell us, where'd you grow up? Where are you from?
Well, I'm originally from Woonsocket, Rhode Island. It's a pretty small state where everybody knows each other, but I resided there until I was into my early 20s, and then I moved to Massachusetts and have lived in Massachusetts ever since.
What got you into EMS in the first place?
It was actually a buddy of mine in high school. I was 14 years old when I decided I wanted to be a paramedic, and a buddy of mine and I were speaking in science class one day, and he said, I think I'm going to be a paramedic. And I said, well, what's all that about? And he said, have you ever seen that show Emergency? So at that point I hadn't. So I went and checked it out, and I thought, all right, that's pretty cool. That looks like a good gig. I think I'm going to do that for the rest of my life. And all these years later, that's what I did with my life.
I think you told me one time that you had to meet with the director of EMS in the state of Rhode Island to get into classes.
The kind of the longer story version is that when I was 14 and in Woonsocket back in the 70s, that's in the late 70s, that was junior high school, and you had to meet with your guidance counselor about what you wanted to do for a career so they could line you up with classes in high school. And my guidance counselor said, hey, why don't you take the health occupations course at the vocational school? And so for a couple of periods each week, we would walk up the hill to the voc school, and I'd take health occupations, and I did that for 2 years while I was in high school, which was a great experience because it taught me medical terminology, how to take vitals, assessment stuff. It's mostly to prepare young girls for nursing school, especially back then. But nowadays, it's a variety of people who take the course. So I took that, got some great experience. I did some shadowing of people in the hospital, so I got to get some, exposure to the hospital environment. And because I was so young and I was serious about getting into EMS. When I was a senior in high school, my guidance counselor said, hey, technically you're supposed to be 18 years old in order to take the EMT course, but I'm going to see if I can't get you a hall pass on this. So he called the Department of Public Health OEMS director and said, I got a kid here who's wanting to do this for the last 2 or 3 years. He's pretty committed to this. He's been in the health occupations course. He's an advanced first aid participant and the CPR. He's got certified in CPR, first aid, advanced first aid. And you should talk to him. So they invited me down to Providence. I drove down there from Woonsocket, met with the EMS director, and he said, yeah, okay, you seem like you're really into this and you're very enthusiastic, but don't screw this up. I'm taking a chance on you, letting you in early to the training program. Don't mess it up. So that was my, okay, thank you. Thanks for the vote of confidence. And I got into the EMT course, and I didn't mess anything up, so I didn't embarrass him.
Usually when you have to meet with the director of OEMS, it's not usually a good thing for a provider.
News.
But
yeah, I wasn't even a provider
out.
yet.
Yeah, it worked out for you, though.
Right. That could have been a bad omen.
And you've been in EMS since, over 30 years, right?
Oh, going on 46 years now, actually.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's been a while.
And, when I got into it back in the early 90s, there just weren't that many paramedics around. Most of them were working in the private service, and the good ones really were working for either a flight service or a hospital-based service, and that's kind of where you were working back in the 80s, right?
Yeah, the majority of my career, certainly on my road career and management career, was hospital-based. I got my EMT in 1981 in Rhode Island, then went to Mass and got it in Massachusetts, and I got my paramedic in 86. I went to Northeastern University back when they had a paramedic program in 85 and graduated in 86. And about 6 months after I had become a paramedic, one of the hospital-based clinics, the Leahy Clinic, opened up a paramedic service, a hospital-based paramedic service. So I applied there. I was very fortunate to get it because those were highly competitive jobs. I was just lucky, I guess, and I got that position, and then worked in a variety of hospital-based systems here in Massachusetts for the rest of my career in terms of being on the road and managing until I started Girard & Associates.
Right. So tell us about that. Tell us about your current role and what you're doing now.
I'm presently the president and CEO of Girard and founder of Girard & Associates. We started as a formal company back in 2015, so this will be 21 years that we've been in business, and we do EMS quality improvement. So we help organizations who want to strengthen their CQI programs. In some cases, we have resources that we can help them with if they want to do it in-house and do it on their own, but they need a little bit of help. And in other cases, we manage their entire CQI experience for them. So it depends on the needs of the client, and it's a kind of a custom program kind of thing because every individual agency has its particular needs. But we created a coaching style methodology of CQI, and because of that, we get really good buy-in from the providers. So when we talk to providers, we get some pretty interesting discussions going with them. We create a relationship and a bond with them so that they can trust us, and we act more as a coach than we do as a compliance officer, internal affairs, wag your finger, I told you not to do this again type of CQI process.
And that's really kind of how we got acquainted over a dozen years ago. You had come in to take over our quality improvement program and run report review. And your approach definitely was unique. It was, back then, I think a lot of CQI was very punitive in nature, and yours was much more educational based.
Right. Unfortunately, Jason, it still is. If you, talk to a lot of people in EMS, certainly the providers, they'll tell you their opinion, at least, of the CQI process is that it's still fairly punitive within our profession. And that's very unfortunate because it really should be there to help them become a better provider and help them get over that learning curve, that steep learning curve of how to be a good provider. And because of it, we tend to burn people out a little bit faster by having poor CQI processes in a lot of cases. So it's not worth struggling over. It's something that can be a benefit to your organization if it's done well and done properly.
Yeah. And, if you've been in the business long enough, you come to learn that sometimes EMS calls just don't go well. And you can't improve from that, right? It does. Right. You can build on a bad experience like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yep.
But 46 years. So any calls stand out in that period of time?
Oh, boy. Lots of them. I think, though, the one that really sticks out for me the most isn't as sexy and glamorous as I think. Usually I would imagine when you ask a lot of providers that question, they have that really kind of cool call, right? The car careened off the cliff and took a busload of nuns with it, and they hit the bottom, and they were all still alive, and I climbed down the ravine, and I single-handedly got them back. That's not the one that stands out for me. The one that stands out for me was the 6-month period between when I first became a paramedic and I went to work at the hospital-based system. I was working for a private company in the Boston area. And I had as a partner a medic who had 2 years of paramedic experience, and he was the veteran. He was the longest tenured paramedic of the organization at that point because it was so new. And they had just started their ALS program for this organization a year and a half to 2 years prior to me starting there. So it was all fresh. He and I went on a chest pain call, a simple everyday chest pain call, and we arrived on scene, and it was one of these triple deckers, and we climbed up to the 3rd floor, and the guy was kind of in his attic bedroom type of thing, and he's an overweight big guy sitting on the edge of his bed, clutching his chest, pale, diaphoretic, rocking back and forth and saying, I think I'm going to die. I think I'm going to die.
Listen, the 3rd floor carry down with a heavy patient, that's very unique to EMS.
Yeah. You never hear that, right? That never occurs.
It never happens.
No. And so we trucked up there with all our equipment, Tim and I. My partner's name was Tim, and he was the lead. He was the senior guy, and he went up to the patient, knelt before him, started talking to him, and he turned to me really calmly. And he's one of these low-key kind of guys, really laid back. He never gets worked up. And he said, I want you to go downstairs. Well, he didn't say go downstairs. He said, I want you to get on the AppCore and call medical control and get me orders for 3-nitro and morphine. And now you got to remember, this is back in 1986 because I had just gotten my medic. And back then we were using what's called an AppCore, which I'm sure you remember, Jason. You're almost as old as I am. And where we had this little box, it looks like a shoebox kind of thing, and it's got a flip lid and it's got a phone handset. And it's just like you saw on Emergency, right? The Squad 51 stuff. And so they had a tiny little antenna on it. And in order to get it to get any reception, you kind of have to hang it out the window and stuff and jiggle it or walk to a corner of the room. Inside a tenement building in Everett, Massachusetts, that just wasn't working. We also had an extended antenna on the box of the ambulance. And when the AppCore wouldn't get good reception, we'd have to go down to the ambulance, plug it in, and contact medical direction in that fashion. So I hustled down 3 flights of stairs after just hustling up 3 flights of stairs with all our equipment, get down there, plug in the AppCore, call the hospital, get medical control. And back at this time of EMS and its evolution, we had to call medical control for everything. You had to call to start the IV. You had to call to give a nitro. We didn't have aspirin on the truck back then, so we weren't given aspirin. And what they would typically say to you is something like, give 1 nitro, wait 5 minutes, check a blood pressure, and then come back and get me on the phone and ask me for your next nitro. We'll talk about next course of action. And you kind of had to do that step over and over again. But that doesn't work when you're hustling up and down 3 flights of stairs, especially with an obese gentleman who's having a STEMI. So I said to the doctor, could I please have permission for 3 sublingual nitro? I'll wait 5 minutes between. I'll recheck vital signs and that sort of thing. And then if that doesn't work, I'd like to move on to morphine because we have a problem here in terms of access, getting up and down to the patient. And he said, all right, go ahead with the nitro, but hold off on the morphine. I said, all right, thank you. Good enough. So I hustled back up 3 flights of stairs. And when I walked back into the room, Tim was still on his knees in front of the guy talking to him, and the guy was no longer pale, no longer diaphoretic, no longer rocking in place on his bed, and they were carrying on a casual conversation, just chatting. And when I had left the room, you could see the ST elevations on the 3 lead. We weren't doing 12 leads back then, so it was simple 3 lead stuff. But you could see in lead 2 and 3 that he had ST elevations. When I got back up there, he had no ST elevations, and the guy seemed quite frankly, he seemed fine. And I was like, what did you do? And he just to my partner, he said, nothing, just talk to him. And he still had that really laid back, relaxed vibe to him. So when we got to the hospital, the doctor didn't believe that the report I had given was the same patient. And at that point in time, I was risking, having that doctor not believe in me as a paramedic, but we were able to show him the 3 lead strips. And he was like, holy shit. All right. So this does seem legit. But it really taught me a lot. It taught me that a critical skill in EMS is actually bedside manner, which they don't teach you in paramedic school. It's those soft human skills that can have an impact on the patient's outcome if it's used to your advantage. And I've tried for the rest of my career to emulate that style when doing patient care activities. And in fact, I even use that style when doing CQI activities to talk to other providers because it works just in general with human beings. So it was a big learning experience for me and probably altered the trajectory of my career in terms of how I approach patients.
Yeah, EMS soft skills just isn't taught really in school. It's something that could take a provider years to develop, to be
Right.
able to build instant rapport with a patient and to the point where you're able to calm them down, as in your case there.
Yeah, I for years I went around saying I believe my partner talked that guy out of an MI, and I in half tongue in cheek, but another part of me kind of it certainly minimized his condition
Yeah.
compared to where he could have been had he been amped up even further. Because remember, we got to carry this really overweight guy down 3 flights of stairs in a stair chair, and that is a stressful situation for the provider, the patient rather. So, if that person's already having STEMI and they're ischemic, and then you increase their O2 consumption demands by the anxiety created with huffing them down 3 flights of stairs, well, that could potentially just worsen the situation. But we were able to turn that around. My partner really was able to turn that around.
And you recently wrote an article, or you're working on a series of articles, and I think the first one is on refusals, right? Patient refusals.
Yeah, we have a variety of resources on our website, and one of them, we have articles as well as podcasts, and we recently did an article on patient refusals subtitled as the most preventable dangerous call in EMS. And we put out the intro article to that series. It's a 7-part series, and we put out the intro, and it got quite a few hits to the website. It's still actually rolling along as one of the most popular articles we've written. We put out part 1 last week, and that's also hitting all-time highs for readership for them. So it seems to be resonating with people in terms of this topic and the information that we're presenting.
I know I've sent that article on to some of the people I work with as well. It was really good. Tell us about the podcast that you do and your partner.
We do. My partner, Kevin Kelly, who's an EMS lawyer, he's a lawyer. He's an EMS person. He's been in EMS for, 30, 40 years, but he's also a practicing lawyer. And he's actually my company lawyer. And he and I partnered to do the Gene Way podcast. And we talk about EMS quality improvement stuff. Everything about, including those soft skills we mentioned earlier. We talk about that and its impact on patient outcomes and patient care. We talk about medical direction. In fact, our most recent podcast is about aligning your medical director's personality and style to the organization's personality and style. And we discuss what to do when you have a weak medical director who doesn't want to participate. So we talk about medical director-related issues and how that impacts the CQI process and your ability to do a good job. I've heard a lot of paramedics who are not in management or CQI say they listen because it gives them insight into how CQI people think and how they look at issues, and that informs them in terms of how to be a better paramedic and to avoid getting into having costly mistakes that could be problematic for them down the road. So it's a little bit for everybody, and they can get that through our website if interested.
Yeah, and I'll put links to everything in the show notes so that people can
Thank you.
get a hold of the article, take a look at your website, and listen to that podcast as well. So let's talk about the most dangerous decision a paramedic's going to make. Let's start off with, why do we treat refusals like low acuity calls when they're really, in some cases, not?
Yeah, I think I think there's a variety of reasons. And what I've come to learn in CQI is that oftentimes problems are a result of multiple small bad decisions as opposed to single large decisions. And oftentimes it's, people misunderstanding things, misinterpreting protocols and that sort of thing. And I think there's a gamut of reasons for, in our profession, people feeling like a refusal is a call that I just got out of, as opposed to a call that I have to do. And we can't think like that because there are significant downstream implications to a provider getting a refusal. And those downstream implications can get you in a ton of trouble, as well as be very bad for the patient from an outcome standpoint. So I think first we have to change that attitude that this is just a call that I don't have to do. And if I can actually solicit the refusal, I can prevent having to go through all the effort of doing a call. I think we have to change the opinions of a lot of people that it's not really a call, when in fact it is very much a call and needs to be handled as such in order to do it properly and to stay out of trouble. And that's an uphill slog. I get especially with the articles. We have other articles on refusal topics and podcasts on refusal topics on our website, and we get a lot of communications from people who email us and say, our organization just doesn't take this as seriously as they should, and they can't really understand why. So it's a critical area, very important, and needs to be emphasized a whole lot more than it probably is in paramedic school and in terms of policy setting from managers and regulatory bodies and that sort of thing.
Right, right. Now, why do refusals pose more of a long-term risk to the provider than a high acuity call actually would?
Yeah, I think because the call itself is riskier, meaning if you even do a lousy job of assessing, treating, and transporting a patient, you've at least gotten them to the hospital, and you did it with you in the back, with somebody in the back in attendance. So even if you didn't do a great job on that call, there's room to fix any potential clinical issues or problems once they get to the hospital. They can get properly assessed, properly treated, admitted if they need be, and that sort of thing. So any bad clinical outcomes can be minimized. But on a refusal, that's not the case, right? Here, please sign my paper here. You turn, you leave. And if the patient's having anything serious going on and their condition worsens and they have a bad outcome, you've exposed yourself to the liability of a lawsuit, of getting sanctioned from OEMS, in some cases losing your livelihood if you get your paramedic ticket revoked because you were that callous in performing your duties in terms of executing that patient refusal. Providers have gotten in tons of trouble, and unfortunately we get called into agencies because of these types of calls sometimes. And the chief of the agency will say to me, yeah, we're calling you because we just had a bad call a few months ago. It went to OEMS. The provider got sanctioned. It resulted in a lawsuit. Our folks were deposed and went to court. Very stressful. So easier to lose your ticket on a refusal than it is on a call, because at least taking the patient to the hospital shows some degree of concern on your part to get the patient something that they need in terms of their overall care. And it doesn't look that way when you get a refusal.
Right. I can remember many, many years ago, somebody had said to me, if you just put them in the truck and drive them to the hospital, you really can't get in that much trouble. Does that still stand, or?
I don't know if that stands, because you can still get in trouble when you do a transport, right? In spite of what I just said, if you treat the patient poorly, don't assess them properly, you treat the wrong thing, give the wrong drug, there's so many things that could potentially go wrong that you can still get in trouble for. But in relation to the refusal versus the transport, it looks a lot worse for you if you got a refusal signed and they woke up dead the next, 2 hours later. It's going to look a lot worse for you than if you at least did the transport. So partially true.
When a refusal goes bad, what is the first question you're asking when you're reviewing that case?
Yeah, we ask a whole lot of questions, really. We have a very analytical process. What we're always looking for on every call is who did what and when. So we're looking to see, what was done for the patient and who did it, obviously, but we're also looking at when they did it. Was it done in a timely manner? So, if you have a patient having chest pain and having a cardiac type condition and it took you 20 minutes to give aspirin, we're looking for that. So on refusals, when the refusal gets executed, we're looking to see whether it was done properly and who was responsible for the majority of the refusal, which is usually the tech of the call, right? The person who's addressing the patient directly. That person usually in most systems also writes the report. So normally we're able to kind of see the actions of that particular person in depth, but we're looking for everybody's actions on that call. So good documentation is critical so that we can get that information to make sure that everything was done the way it should be done.
Right. What does it mean when the PCR becomes the case in practical terms for the provider?
Yeah, that's a term that you hear oftentimes from a legal standpoint, but it can also be from an investigatory standpoint, is the primary data set that's going to be obtained by anybody who's looking at this call downstream is going to be that PCR. And they can pull other things, dispatch records and other records, but really, the vast majority of information is going to be obtained from the PCR. And regardless of what really happened on the call, you're going to be judged based on how you documented the call, which can look very different from how things went down in real time. And we hear this from paramedics all the time and EMTs all the time when we talk to them, and they, we have questions for them, and they say, "But Paul, it's not really what happened. Here's what happened." And then they start filling in details, and you say, "Well, that all should have made it to the report, right? Because if that's what it takes to explain it to me so I understand it, so that it's clear and concise, that's what you need to get into your run report." So what is documented in the report is going to be the official record, and is going to be what most of the decision-making is going to be based off of if people are looking to determine if something went wrong. In fact, we often refer to that report as either being your defense or your demise. It can either help in your defense to get you out of trouble, or it can screw you to the wall if it's written poorly, or if there's a lot of bad data in there that suggests that you did things wrong. It can lead to your professional demise.
Right. And, you certainly don't want to be sitting on the stand years later recounting care or treatment that occurred that's not in your run report.
People can't remember what happened a few days after the call when we go and talk to them about a call, and they'll be like, "Hey, that happened 2 weeks ago or last week or something. I don't remember this patient. I don't remember the call." So how are you going to remember that months from now? So really, the way you're going to remember it is by having good, solid documentation, because that's your memory. So that's what you're going to use, that you'll be allowed to use legally as your memory and recollection of the call, and your proof is going to be in the report itself.
So why does the documentation outweigh the provider's memory months, years later?
I think all the science and data, and you read this all the time, is that human memory is so frail and it acts in such odd ways, especially the longer the time from the time of the incident. So the longer that time period is, the more your brain starts to fill in things as factual that were not really factual, and that sort of thing. And juries know that, judges know that, investigatory bodies know that. They know that the further this goes out, the less reliable the human memory is to recall factual events, especially very detailed factual events. So the report is done generally contemporaneously with the call, usually within minutes after, sometimes a day or two if you're allowed to do that sort of thing in your organization. But that's still much better recollection in terms of what you put back then than, trying to remember 6 months later what really happened. So it's just a matter of the human mind is not designed to remember every small, intimate detail about every little event in life. You'd never get through a day without cognitive overload. So the written word is going to act as your memory in the long term if you need it.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about capacity, because everything kind of hinges on capacity.
Right.
What does decision-making capacity really mean to EMS providers?
So it means, capacity in a broad general sense means that the patient understands what's going on. They understand what their condition could potentially be in terms of your description of their risk factors, as well as their ability to understand the risk factors that you described to them. So capacity is really about understanding. And in the terms of decision-making, it's the patient that has to make some of these decisions in terms of the right to refuse, for example, and they can't make that decision. You can't advise them of that decision properly if you aren't sure that they understand the risks and what their situation is. So decision-making capacity is about understanding the problem so that they can make proper decisions.
Right. What are some of the most common capacity failures that you see in refusals?
We see all sorts of capacity failures. We see minors who have signed refusals when they are a minor and can't legally sign a refusal. We see folks who are clearly intoxicated. We see folks with dementia. We see people with language barriers who you can't really communicate well with them, so you have to question whether it was truly an informed decision. And I'm going to throw in one that doesn't sound like a capacity issue, but it ultimately leads to capacity issue problems and is the root of a lot of badly executed refusals, and that's poor assessments. What leads to a lot of the stuff when you talk to providers about their refusals and you say, hey, this patient shouldn't have signed a refusal, in a lot of cases, the assessment's not very thorough and is not done well enough to determine what the patient's potential clinical problems are. And if you can't determine what their potential clinical problems are, how can you advise them of the risks of refusing transport, right? So if you have a patient who has chest pain and is described as sounding somewhat musculoskeletal on assessment, then part of the decision-making has to be describing to the patient what the potential causes of that chest pain might be and which ones are important versus potentially lesser important ones, and to describe to them what could happen if they refuse transport. So if that's not done properly, then it's not a properly informed refusal, which means it can't legally hold up. And what we see most often, Jason, is providers will take what the patient says at face value for their primary complaint and then don't pursue anything else to determine if there's anything else that could be going on. So, for example, we had one patient who signed a refusal once who was complaining of 4 days of constipation, and that was a complaint. So the whole assessment revolved around, well, how long has it been since you pooped? Have you taken X-Lax? That sort of stuff. And there was nothing in there about, hey, this is a potential ACS patient because as part of their constipation, they've got belly pain above the umbilicus. And we were taught in paramedic school, that gets a 12 lead. That could be cardiac. This particular patient was elderly, was female, had high cholesterol, hypertension, had all sorts of risk factors. And instead of exploring all that with the thought that one of the differentials for this patient could be something serious, such as a cardiac disorder, they simply went with, well, patient says she's been constipated for a few days. We advise her to see her doctor. She's going to go see her doctor tomorrow. Please sign here. And we left. So you got to go deeper than just constipation, right? You got to really do a proper assessment, be thorough so that you can understand what risks there are to the patient so that you can then describe those risks to the patient and that they're properly informed of all the things that could go wrong here so that once you leave, if something bad happens, they can't say, I had no idea that could have been my heart. If I'd thought it was my heart, of course I would have gone to the hospital because my dad died at 54 from a heart attack. So you just don't want to be defending that on the witness stand.
Yeah, throw in the family history too, right?
Right, exactly.
So you did mention intoxication in there. So how many beers is okay where a person can still, what do we talk, a 6-pack? They can still make that decision?
For me or for you? So I'm a professional. So the reality is, and this is another one, when we do classes on refusals, or agencies bring us in and we do refusal education for providers and whatnot. And even when we do individual counseling with them about cases, the question always comes up. So when an auditor reviews a run report, if there's any indication that alcohol or drugs is involved, they're going to flag it and say, hey, we need to make sure this is a legit refusal.
Right.
And so when you talk to the providers, they'll say, hey, I don't really believe he was intoxicated, or just because he had one beer, does that mean I have to transport him? Basically the same question you're asking. And the answer is it depends. So it's not a matter of how much alcohol they had or necessarily even when. It's really an issue of whether the patient may be showing signs of intoxication. So if they look like they have diminished capacity to make decisions and understand their situation, just like any other refusal, then you can't allow them to refuse. Alcohol is one of the exemptions in most protocols. It says if the patient is intoxicated, you can potentially take them against their will because they don't have the right to refuse because they don't have capacity. But that all hinges on their ability to understand what's going on and understand their situation and understand the risks of refusing and just like any other patient. So, we had one call again a number of years back where the providers put that they took the patient kind of against their will to the hospital because they reeked of alcohol. But when you talk to the patient, the issue was, I reeked. I spilled a glass of beer on myself. It was all over my clothes. I actually didn't drink more than 3 sips. So you can't take them against their will because they weren't showing that they didn't have capacity. So it all goes back to that capacity. So does the patient understand their situation? Do they understand the potential risks of refusing? Do they understand what clinical conditions could be going on with them medically that should be checked out at a hospital or by, primarily at a hospital, but by other medical professionals? And if you can't show that, then it's irrelevant in terms of the alcohol consumption issue. So now, as I mentioned to you in our discussion, when you say, well, how much is good? When a person says, well, I had a 6-pack in the last, 40 minutes, most people can't tolerate that without being inebriated, impaired. Right? So, impaired. So, some of that you can use to build your case for them being impaired or incapacitated. But you still have to go back to the assessment stuff and the objective findings. What was their mentation like? Are they, times 4? Did they have a steady gait? Did they understand what their circumstances are? Did they keep trying to get up and wander into the street, into traffic while you're trying to talk to them? All that stuff needs to be identified and documented to prove your case later on. So this is always a tricky one because you can't simply go on what they claim to have taken or done, because we know patients don't always tell the truth. Sometimes the cops are standing right there, so they're not going to admit to the marijuana use. All that sort of information that they might not give to you accurately. It really kind of comes down to that independent assessment and how they look and how they act, and whether they're answering questions for you appropriately and that sort of thing.
And I would think that, is that on your side or my side?
I think those are my dogs barking this time.
We'll give that a second to clear out. Get down. I said get down.
Yeah. I think somebody knocked at the door, so that always sets them off.
God, my dogs do the same thing. I was going to, well, it's like magic. It just stopped, huh?
Yeah.
So if you're going to determine that the patient doesn't have capacity because they smell of alcohol or reek of beer, I think you'd probably need to be able to articulate a few more reasons and document a few more reasons than just that.
Yeah. And again, people don't, right? And that's the detriment that's the problem with their documentation and the execution of the refusal. Either they didn't go deeper or they didn't document that they went deeper.
Right.
But yeah, there's all sorts of other stuff that you can use to describe what the patient looked like and what led you to believe that they were competent or not competent to sign this document. So it should clearly go beyond just the patient had a lot to drink, or the patient, claims to only have had 1 beer and seems alert and oriented times 4, so we got the refusal. That's really loose and not nearly thorough enough. You really need to get more into the assessment stuff of what makes the patient look like they can understand what's going on.
Yeah, but we really do like hard numbers, right? Just give me a number. Is it 1, 2, 3? That's kind of what we like.
Right. Yeah, we do. Black and white is always better. It's always preferable. Yeah. But we work in a gray profession, right? There aren't a lot of black and white situations. Well, I shouldn't say there aren't a lot, but there's so much gray area in EMS and so much subjectivity, right? Different people can read that same run report and conclude 2 different things from that run report. So it's incumbent upon you to be as clear and precise as possible so that people can't misinterpret the information that you're documenting.
What about patients that are threatening suicide, right? The threatening suicide, do they have capacity? Because in some states, it's certainly legal, right, to kill yourself.
Yeah, it's legal to kill yourself. I mean, every protocol is different, so you have to make sure that you're up to date on your local protocol. But in general, patients who are threatening suicidal or harming others, and they're threatening that, they generally can't sign a refusal. So you may need to consider getting police involved, or contacting medical control is also an excellent option. Should folks who are considered, for any of the cases we've talked about today, really, Jason, but certainly when people are talking about suicide or homicide ideations, then you need to get other people involved and make sure you don't leave. We had a case a number of years ago, I think I mentioned this to you previously, where the patient wrote a note and he left it on the kitchen dining room table, and he was sitting there waiting for the providers. The girlfriend called because on the phone he was threatening to commit suicide. They show up, they find the note, the patient's alert and oriented, sitting there, and he seemed fine. He seemed relaxed. He was subdued, wasn't really being aggressive. And he said, no, I was just trying to get a rise out of my girlfriend. We had a fight. I was trying to get a rise out of my girlfriend. That's why I said all that stuff. But he wrote a note. So the providers got the refusal because he was alert and oriented times 4. He was not acting unreasonable. He seemed fine. And so they felt comfortable getting that refusal signed. But everybody downstream was like, but he wrote a note,
Mm-hmm.
So you really need to take that one the extra mile. You need to get police involved just to make sure that you have other professionals there to help you with this. If they can PC him or something, then that helps that you left them with somebody reasonable to look after them. You want to get medical control online to have this discussion with them, because in a lot of cases, medical control is not going to be comfortable with you leaving somebody who made a phone call, first off, threatened to harm himself, and then went to the effort of writing a note. Other people may not agree with you that just leaving that patient behind is a good idea. So you want to employ as many other active participants into that call as you can to help make a proper decision on it.
Right. Let's talk about provider-induced refusals.
Yeah, I love these. There's all sorts of stuff on the internet these days with providers behaving badly. There's one from Phoenix Fire where a crew of 3 providers, including a captain, are shown on a Ring doorbell camera advising the patient that, they can take them to the hospital, but it's going to cost $1,500 or $1,600 for the transport. And I know what I'd want to do with $1,600 if I had it. And that's a provider trying to convince a patient not to go to the hospital. And we term them, and other people have termed them, provider-induced patient refusals or PIPers. And a provider-induced refusal is just what it sounds like. It's when the provider either actively or inactively tries to solicit a refusal from the patient so they don't have to do the transport. And is a no-no. In pretty much every protocol that I've ever seen, there is not one protocol that says if you can talk the patient out of going, it's okay to not take them to the hospital. They always advocate for those patients to be transported in pretty much every case. And it's the patient alone who should make that decision about whether they want to be transported to the hospital or not after you've properly informed them.
Have you determined what's inbounds or out of bounds? If patient's asking you what the wait time is going to be at the hospital, where does that fall into it for the provider, right? Should we even be offering that information to them?
Yeah, see, that's the hard part is, again, we're talking about some of these things in terms of them being black and white, but there is a lot of gray area because you're supposed to properly inform the patient so they can make a prudent decision. And sometimes some of their questions might require that you be honest with them, but that might look like you're inducing a refusal, for example. So if a patient says to you, hey, I went there 2 weeks ago, I sat for 4 hours in the waiting room. Are they busy? Because I don't want to do that again. And, you can't lie to the patient. On the other hand, if you say to the patient, they're very busy in the ER right now, so you might have to wait, that looks like you're inducing a provider-induced refusal, right? It looks like you're trying to convince the patient that they shouldn't go or they don't need to go.
Right, or influence them not to.
Or influencing their decision, exactly. Yeah, good term there. So some of this comes down to intent, which is awfully difficult to prove. So what we tell providers is if you have to give the patient information so they can make a prudent decision that makes it look like you might be inducing them, when you speak to the patient and when you document to the patient, you really should be putting exactly what occurred in terms of that discussion. And the discussion should be something like, I don't want to go because I had to wait 4 hours last time. Are they busy? Well, we were just there an hour ago. They do have quite a few. It is a fairly busy ER. However, we are still advising that based on your condition and the things that you've got going on, that you be seen at the hospital, be evaluated to make sure that there's nothing going on with you. They can do a much more thorough exam than we can in the field to determine if there's something serious going on. And in spite of how busy it is in the ER, we still recommend transport. So you don't just want to, put, patient didn't want to go because it was really busy in the ER, so we got a refusal signed and we left. Right. So you really have to show that you made an effort to convince them to go and that you had a conversation with them to try to allay their concerns and their fears. And if the patient still doesn't want to go after that, you document that you still were recommending that they do the right thing and they still were refusing to do so.
So why does helping the patient decide later get framed as coercion or abandonment?
Because in most cases, that's only coming on after somebody filed a complaint. And people usually file a complaint because something bad happened. So there's a trail of events here that makes you look guilty from the outset. So most refusals don't go to further review in terms of OEMS or a regional regulatory body of some sort or become a legal case. By the time they get to that point, it's because somebody feels like something bad happened. So now it looks like, something bad happened to this patient, or at least that's the accusation, and you guys were there an hour earlier and you left with a refusal. So it already looks suspicious. It already looks like perhaps you did something wrong, and now you're playing defense, right? You're trying to prove that whatever happened wasn't a result of your actions, and the only way to prove that is to have a run report that's complete and thorough to show that you did everything you did that you were supposed to do and that you documented it fully and that you weren't trying to get out of the call. So, we see run reports, refusals that are the crew was on scene 4 minutes, 6 minutes, 8 minutes. So right out of the gate, if you have an on-scene time of 6 minutes for a refusal, the assumption is you couldn't have been that thorough in 6 minutes to get a refusal signed. So there's all sorts of data that they're going to extract from that report that they're going to use to either try to nail you to the wall Or if it's your defense lawyer, you want to give them lots of data in your report that gives you defenses for everything that you did and everything that you said on that call. And again, it's only factual if it's in the report.
Right. Right. So what language should never, or what words should never appear in a refusal narrative?
Well, that's a hard one because you have to document what really happened, including if it sounds bad.
So people use standard language all the time in narratives.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
maybe they might put in there up to and including the risk of death.
Yeah. Yeah. See, that's one of them. And this is what the statement itself is not inherently bad. There's a couple, but there's things to it that you have to offset in your documentation. So generalizations in your documentation, even for a transport, using generalizations is generally bad. Because if you use a generalization, when you try to defend yourself later on, all a prosecutor has to do is to poke a hole in one element of that generalization, and it invalidates all the other stuff of that generalization. So for example, in a refusal, a lot of providers were taught to document that you advise the patient of all the risks of refusing care up to and including death, or something similar, some similar terminology.
I've written that myself.
I have too. In my early years, I used to as well until I learned better. And when you just say generically that we advise the patients of all risks, by the time it gets to a lawsuit or an OEMS investigation because of a complaint, the argument is going to be, well, the patient ended up having an obstructed bowel. Did you advise them of that risks? Because the patient says you never did, and that's what they ended up having. So you now are using your memory, and because all you have on the report is all risk up to. So when you're on the witness stand, when they start to say, oh, they're going to pick the 400 items that could potentially be the cause of their condition, say, so you advise them of this one, and they're going to pick something minor that you wouldn't even think of, and you're going to say, well, no, I didn't. So then your statement is untrue. You did not advise them of all the risks, did you? And already you're on the ropes. You're already trying to defend yourself that you didn't advise them of all the risks. Therefore, you didn't advise them of the important ones that ultimately led to something bad happening to them. So using that generalization is poor. You want to describe the actual risks you advise the patient of in detail. And then the second half of that statement is up to and including death, which is great if they have a condition that could lead to death. But, if I jam my thumb in the door jamb of my car when I was getting out by accident, and for some reason EMS shows up, and I say, yeah, I just jammed my thumb in the door. I don't need to go to the hospital. Don't want to go to the hospital. I'll sign your paper. And you put in there that you advise me of everything up to and including death, then it makes it look like you're writing that statement as a cover your ass statement. Because in what world, in what universe would that result in death? That clearly is a bogus statement. So you don't want to write it unless you mean it, unless that's what you really advise them. Now, if, for some reason you felt that thumb injury was really, really bad and could cause them to die, but explain that in a little more depth, right? So the patient's 82 years old, has significant cardiac history. Their blood pressure right now is 210/190 as a result of the pain that they're in. Are you thinking that they could, cause themselves to stroke out or have a heart attack and die? Okay, maybe perhaps you could build it that way, but you want to make sure you document that that's your decision-making thought process, and that's why you advise them the way you advise them. But you also want to have all that other language of the other risks that you advise them of.
Right. What are some of the documentation gaps or shortfalls that you most often see in these high exposure refusal cases?
Yeah, the biggest one is a lack of assessment. People are not doing full assessments. So the documentation shortfalls include they'll do a really good focused exam. They'll describe that thumb injury in great depth, but not do a head-to-toe exam. So if they have something else that could be going on, it could potentially be missed. In some cases, the reverse is true. We've got a great head-to-toe exam, but there's just one line, patient having chest pain times 20 minutes, and then they didn't do much of a focused exam. So you want to have both of those for every patient to show that you were thorough in your assessments. You want to have serial vital signs. Oftentimes on refusals, we don't see serial vital signs. We'll see one set and that's it. It's good that they at least took one set because a lot of reports don't even have that on a refusal where they don't even get a set of vitals. So certainly at a minimum one, but preferably more than one. So it shows you stayed with them for a little bit of time. You spent some time with them. You reassessed to see if there were any changes, at least in your presence while you were there. And if there were changes, that gives you an opportunity to explain that to the patient and say, hey, your pressure was normal last time, but it just spiked by, 20 or 30 points, 10 minutes later. There's something clearly going on. You really should get that checked out. So we see gaps in the documentation on the assessment side, a lack of serial vitals, and then that generalization stuff I mentioned where people are using general statements. And there's a bunch of them. There's, for presumption of death, which is not a true refusal, right? If you go to a DOA and, the cops call you in and just say, hey, he's probably been dead a long time. He looks really dead, but we want you guys to come in and confirm it. Providers will often write stuff like presumption of death protocol followed. And a presumption of death protocol for most agencies includes stuff like listening to heart sounds for 30 seconds, listening to respiratory sounds, lung sounds for 30 seconds, putting them on a monitor, doing a variety of steps to verify death. And providers will use that general statement, but that's not good enough. You really want to specify the things that you did in detail. So whenever you make a general statement, stroke protocol negative, nope, not good enough. Tell us what you saw on the stroke exam, all the elements of the stroke protocol that you employed and what you found on your assessment for each of those elements. So that'll get you out of more trouble because it'll show that you're being thorough. It'll show that you're being proper. It'll show that you did everything you were supposed to for that stroke exam, that presumption or whatever describing the risks of refusal. And that'll buy you a lot more credibility that you weren't just sign my paper so I can leave and get back to lunch.
Right.
So that's an important piece of this.
What role does metadata, timestamps, and audit trails now play into modern investigations?
Yeah, it's playing more and more now. So we're seeing investigators pull back-end monitor data to see exactly what you did with that monitor. Your EPCR program probably logs every keystroke you put into that thing. So if you spell diarrhea with one R instead of two, and you go back and you correct it a few minutes later, there's a good chance that it'll see that level of detail in your PCR documentation. So it's not just the hard copy printed version that they are looking at for data. They're looking on the back end to see what's going on. In one case, that was a refusal. It was determined that the patient's signature had been forged and that the signature was obtained 20 minutes after they got back to base by using geolocation on their vehicle. So they could tell that they were sitting in quarters when the signature portion of the report was signed. So how could that have been from the patient? So you're supposed to get that on scene, right? Supposed to get those signatures on scene. You're supposed to write your whole report on scene because when they sign your report, they're supposed to be verifying that everything you wrote in the report is true and accurate, right? They should be reviewing your narrative, your story, your data input and saying, okay, now sign. So to just have a signature be put on later isn't necessarily as helpful as it could be. So, besides that, we've seen video data. You should assume on every call you're on that you're being video and audio recorded because there's a good possibility you are. There are street recorders on every street corner, on every lamppost nowadays. People's Ring cameras. We have nanny cams where the eye of the teddy bear sitting on the mantle is a recorder so they can catch the nanny, whether she's abusing Johnny. So, and all these things have been pulled in some cases to accuse providers of not doing the things that they were supposed to be doing, including walking patients when they should be carrying them and such. There was a case a few years back where at the court system, the crew was accused of walking a patient, not bringing their equipment to the side of the patient, doing their assessment at the patient's side. And the run report said they did all that, but when they pulled, they were in the courthouse. So Jason, if there's going to be cameras, you think they're going to be in the courthouse? And they didn't think of that when they dealt with the call improperly and then fudged the documentation after. So there's another case, again, where you might not expect it, where the crew was out in the middle of the woods doing an extrication out in a wooded territory. And they saw their actions on the evening news because the local news channel had a drone in the air and they were recording the extrication. And they didn't realize that because they were busy treating the patient and extricating him out of the woods. And who'd have thought, a quarter mile out in the woods that there'd be cameras seeing what you're doing out there. So you cannot assume, no matter what circumstance you're under, that you're not being recorded and should act accordingly, right? Act professional, do the right thing, and then make sure your documentation squarely matches up with what the actions were in the field. And that's your best defense.
you probably shouldn't say to the patient, hey, swing by the base later on today and sign this refusal for me.
Yeah, right. And while you're
If
at
you
it, bring
get
us
a
some
chance,
cookies. Yeah, if you
you
get,
get
yeah,
a
if you get some
chance
time.
tomorrow, don't let it go a week. Just come by
Right,
and sign
right.
it.
Yeah.
Gosh.
Right.
Wow. So I was going to ask you about Ring cameras and third party, but you pretty much already covered all that. So let's talk a little bit about high risk refusal scenarios. And you talked about in your article, lift assist being the hidden refusal.
Yeah. Yeah. This is one, again, that we get a lot of pushback from providers, and we get equal pushback from the state, for example, or a lot of states where they're outlawing or banning lift assists. Here in Massachusetts, it's outlawed. It actually says in the protocol that OEMS does not recognize the term lift assist in being a valid EMS call. There's no such thing as a lift assist. You get on scene. If there's somebody there, you're getting a refusal. And you can imagine how much the providers love that, right? Because in the real world, we get it called frequently just to help, lift Granny up a couple of stairs. But when you talk to OEMS, they say, yeah, but Paul, how do you know Granny couldn't get up the stairs because? And then he lists off all the reasons that she could have something clinical wrong with her, which prevents her from getting up the stairs. And it's a valid point, right? And if you didn't do a refusal where you documented your assessment, then you don't have anything to defend yourself later on should a challenge arise. So it's really a defensive mechanism as well for you to do the assessment to make sure that there's nothing going on with them clinically, and also documenting that you did that assessment. And in all cases, you should not be advising a patient not to go. So it should be, here's what we found, and we recognize that we can't diagnose you in the field. That's not a thing, right? We're not able to do that sufficiently. They can only do that in the hospital. In the hospital, they have people who trained at the physician level, which we're not. They have equipment. They have specialists. They have all sorts of resources at the hospital we don't have in the field. And because of that, we're still advising you to get checked out and make that patient make that decision as opposed to you. But providers don't like the caveat that there's no such thing as a lift assist. Well, what about, the little lady who just stood up from getting out of bed and her feet slipped on the rug and she slid slowly down and, down to the floor in a sitting position. Not that ever happens, right?
Yeah.
And again, OEMS's response to, well, how do you know that Granny wasn't also dizzy? How do you know that she wasn't hypotensive from laying for the last 12 hours and she's a little bit hypotensive, and when she sat up, it caused her to near syncope? How do you know? So, and we know patients are not accurate historians and are not always accurate storytellers, right? So just saying that, well, grandma said she doesn't have any medical problems, she just slipped and fell slowly and slid down to the floor. That's okay. You document that's what she said, but then you still need to do an assessment because patients sometimes don't realize they're injured, don't realize that they're not feeling well. And again, you don't want something bad to happen after you leave. It never looks good, ever, 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 when a crew goes to a call and the beginning of the report is, we were here 2 hours earlier for. That's never a good way to, it's a good way to start the report to write it, right? Because that's factually correct. So I'm not saying it's a bad way to make the statement, but I'm saying it always is kind of, everybody who reads it's like, oh, what did they miss? What happened here? How did they miss something that they shouldn't have? Did they get a refusal that they shouldn't have gotten on that patient? Now things got worse and now you're back. So again, it just puts you in a bad position in terms of defending yourself because it just looks bad from the outset. So you don't want to get into that kind of bind.
Right. If you're lifting a patient up off the floor, and you said it several times during this podcast, right? It really, you've got to do an assessment of the patient. You have to put your hands on them.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Jason Falvey. Thank you for spending part of your day with me here on In Service. If something from this episode hit home, maybe it reminded you of a call, a shift, or a hard lesson learned, follow the show and please send it to just one person and ask them to follow. Now let's get in service.
You mentioned repeat callers. Why is this especially dangerous from a refusal standpoint?
Yeah, this is another trap for the unwary. It's also another one where providers sometimes feel like they've got some leeway to get out of this call. But this is, if refusals are high risk, the routine refusal is super high risk. And it's because even the boy who cried wolf eventually will have a medical problem. And if you just treat him like you always treated him and allow him to sign and walk away, the likelihood of missing that problem when it finally does occur is significant. So And again, we have lots of examples of this that we've audited over the 21 some odd years. We've got hundreds of thousands of run reports we've reviewed, tens of thousands of refusal run reports. And, there was a case a few years back where we started with a new agency. We were just starting out. And so I was meeting, it happened to be a client that I was the coordinator for. So I was meeting with the providers and we're talking about refusals. And they had a patient that would call them 2 or 3 times a week, usually at 2 a.m. And it's because the guy gets lonely, and especially around the holidays. And so he would call and go to the hospital because he needed some socialization. And the guys would say, well, he would call for chest pain, but he has significant anxiety. And he would sometimes be discharged from the hospital before we were done writing our report. And we do him 3 times a week. He's a regular. We all know him. Even the mutual aid guys. Yeah, I know, right?
That's going to suck you in.
Come in.
Yeah.
Oh, that sucks you in. And again, we've all been there,
suck
right?
you in.
Yep. You're tired. You've had a busy day. It's 2 a.m. You're exhausted. So we've all done it. We've all had those patients where they are anxiety, they're psych patients. There's this whole group of folks that, sometimes they abuse the EMS system. It's abusive. But in this particular case, when I was reviewing the case with the providers, I say, all right, let's flip this on its head. Let's look at this for all the reasons you should transport him. He's 72 years old. He's morbidly obese, which is for them another reason to get the refusal so they don't have to carry him out because he's having chest pain, right?
And he lives on the 3rd floor.
And he lives on the 3rd floor, right? And the patient's got hypertension and all sorts of risk factors, but one of his risk factors is he's had an episode of cardiac arrest 5 or 6 years ago. He's had cabbages and stents. So he's a significant cardiac patient who calls with chest pain that because in their recent interactions with him at the hospital, supposedly he was diagnosed as just being anxiety and sent home later that same day without even being admitted. They were getting to the point where they were just throwing him on the stretcher and taking him up to the hospital, or in some cases getting refusals signed on the patient. So this went on for a while. I was talking to each provider. I'd have to give them the speech all over again because everybody individually felt that way. So everybody you meet with, you have these discussions. And a couple months later, we're sitting at M&M rounds. And one of the providers who gave me the most pushback was actually the EMS coordinator for the agency. So he's the guy who's supposed to be telling his guys not to do that stuff. And he felt as well that this was just a routine frequent flyer that they know well. And they don't feel the need to put them through all that IV aspirin nitro stuff because it's not necessary in their minds. So a couple months later, we're all sitting in M&M rounds, and the medical director for these agencies that surround the hospital, that all go to the hospital for M&M rounds, said, hey, y'all remember Mr. Smith? And everybody's like, oh, yeah, we know Mr. Smith. And he's like, well, he died last week. And so the room got quiet, as you might imagine, and everybody kind of was like, ooh, shit.
Who ran that call?
Who ran that one? Right. So after a pregnant pause, he went into the presentation, which is the typical anxiety, chest pain that he always has. But he finished that up with, okay, at the hospital here, it was determined it was cardiac. He went to the cath lab. He had procedures. He went to ICU. 2 days later, he ended up dying, coding and dying. And so he, as part of M&M rounds, the physician brings the medical record, the run report, right, and reviews the run report. And in this case, the providers did everything they were supposed to. So there was a collective sigh of relief. And on the way out the door, the EMS coordinator said to me, hey, man, that was my call. And I could have lost my ticket over that one if I had just treated him as anxiety again, because that's how he was presenting. He was still presenting as, I don't think this is cardiac. So he kind of, and he became actually an apostle after that. After that is, we'd have these discussions. He'd be like, yep. And he was much more in tune when talking to his guys with that the QA process was meant to help you. And he would actually use his own experience, which was big of him, and say, hey, here's one I could have gotten a lot of trouble with that I was routinely screwing up. And, Girard was busting my chops about transporting him. So I finally transported him.
Yes.
And nothing bad happened to us. So that frequent flyer situation is so risky because you're not only thinking, okay, this is just going to be a refusal that I can get out of. I'll be out of here in 10 minutes. But you're also thinking, and I know this guy and I know it's bullshit. So you're already tainted that there's probably nothing going on here. And the only way to know if there really is to do the full assessment. So so don't get fooled by the frequent flyer. People do all the time. They get in all sorts of trouble. And this is one of those where you could lose your ticket over it.
Right. It sounds like that guy had his road to Damascus moment, right, with this patient.
Yeah, exactly.
When should we contact medical control?
So it depends on your protocol is the lawyer answer, right? But the reality is your protocol should articulate for you or may articulate for you what types of cases you are required to call medical control. But most protocols have that disclaimer statement of any call that doesn't seem right to you kind of statement. And, when talking to providers, I'll sometimes say, hey, listen, that call that you get sometimes where your spidey tingling, the senses are tingling. You can't really pinpoint it. You can't really say there's anything. He looks minor. He doesn't look bad, but there's something about it that just makes you feel, I don't feel right about this. Even if you can't articulate it, call medical control, right? That's what they're there for. Unfortunately, a lot of medical control agencies don't want to do their jobs, where they sometimes berate providers for calling them when they don't need to, especially on refusals. It's kind of like, well, if they're refusing, what are you calling me for? Just get the paperwork signed and get the heck out of there. And so providers will say to me, well, I didn't call medical control and we got this refusal on a patient who was, borderline at best because they don't want to be bothered. And I tell them over and over again the same thing. And it's if they don't want to be bothered with you calling them for refusal when you are supposed to or you feel you need to, they're not doing their job. If you don't call them, you're now not doing your job. So still call them. And if they tell you to go pound sand and stop bothering me, guess what's getting documented in that run report, right? Call medical direction was not helpful at all. Refused to listen to the report and just advise us to have the patient sign the paper without getting, full clarity on what the situation was. So you need to, and you probably should be talking to management about that to have them go back and try to work with the hospital to get that fixed. But don't allow a nurse or a physician or somebody who's going to give you crap when you call for medical control or as you're supposed to. Don't let them hang you out to dry, because when something bad happens, if you never made the phone call, you've got no defense that medical direction wasn't going to help you. It's on you for not calling medical control. So call them anyway. If they don't like it, it's their problem. And you can show in your report that you made every effort that you were supposed to. And therefore, you covered all your bases. When I say cover your bases, I also mean cover the bases for the patient, because ultimately, that's what we're worried about, right? Something bad happening to the patient. And I hope most of us got into EMS to help patients and not let bad things happen to them. So if not, you probably shouldn't be in EMS. But if you truly care about the patients, then you want to make sure you're doing a good job for them to uncover anything that could be a problem, advising them properly, calling medical control, calling anybody else who will help, to help you convince the patient to go, and documenting that, right? The daughter on scene was also trying to convince mom to go. She was crying. She was imploring mom so badly to go to the hospital. That's much more powerful than just, we advised the patient. She said no. So get that into your documentation.
Yeah. And you had mentioned once before that you had a refusal where the provider or the medic called the medical control got on the phone with the patient, and that changed the outcome. You want to talk about that one?
Yeah, that happens all the time. It's happened to me, where I'm damn convincing when I want to be. And there are some patients who, still don't want to listen to Paul. And you call medical control and they say, hey, I'm the doctor at the ER. I'm really concerned about your heart. I think you should come to the hospital. I strongly advise you to go to the hospital. And they go, oh, okay, you're the doctor. Okay. And they do, because physicians, for some people, carry weight more so than a paramedic carrying weight. So sometimes that other opinion can get people to change their minds. And the more people that, are trying to convince the patient, if you document it, that makes it look that much stronger that it wasn't just you, but the police officer saying, hey, Mrs. Smith, you don't look good. I'm just a cop, but I think you should go to the hospital. You document that, because that's great proof that you were all making best effort to try to get the patient to go. So later on, if the accusation is you guys didn't try very hard, you just, allowed grandma to sign and you waltzed off, you can show that that's just not true.
Right. How about patients with language barriers? We come across that all the time as EMS providers.
Yeah.
How do those refusals stand up?
Those are,
And
again,
what
those
should
are
we
brutal.
do?
Yeah. So there's a few things you can do. Today we live in the world of technology, which is fantastic. There are phone translation apps that you can use. There are subscription translation services. Some departments actually hire out a company to be available 24/7 with a hotline, and they have employees that speak a variety of different languages in case you need them. You can call medical control and say, hey, I've got somebody who speaks whatever. Hospitals are pretty diverse organizations. They have translators on staff in most cases, and sometimes they can get you somebody who'll speak that patient's language. So the problem with language barrier is it's very difficult to prove capacity when you're not even speaking the same language. And we've had many, many cases where it was highly questionable whether the patient truly understood what was going on. In one case, we had a young girl, 13, I think she was 13 years old, 13-year-old girl who spoke whatever language that the patient spoke, Portuguese, I think it was, or Spanish or something. And they were translating, the providers were translating through a 13-year-old girl. So when you've got to first explain it to a 13-year-old girl so she understands it well enough to describe it to mom, right, or grandma.
Right.
But even if you do that, you have no idea how the girl is truncating that discussion and phrasing it different from how you would have phrased it when describing those situations and risks and concerns to the patient. So even though the patient's nodding, I don't want to go, and, nope, 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 you really don't know what that any translator is saying. But in particular, somebody who's very young, for example, in this case. So you have to make best efforts to make sure that the patient fully understands the risks of refusal so that you can establish competency. And if you don't even know what the patient's saying or what the translator's saying to the patient on your behalf, then you can't say that you know that the patient understood the risks. So it's not truly an informed refusal. So again, the answer is to employ every resource at your disposal. We've had in that one case, we had a patient who spoke a different language, and the provider spent about 60 minutes on scene, 55, 60 minutes or something like that on scene, trying to convince the patient to go, trying to understand. And finally, one of the paramedics looked at the pill bottle and saw the doctor's name and said, "Oh, Dr. Smith lives in town. I know that guy." So he called the physician, the patient's physician, and it said, "Hey, here's what's going on. Can you give us any history on this patient, any medical history, anything that'll help us understand what's going on with the patient?" He said, "I can do better than that. I can talk to the patient and translate for you, and I'll tell her she's got, as her physician, I want her to go to the hospital." So he got involved, translated information, provided medical information on behalf of the patient for the providers to use. And the patient was like, "Oh, okay, doctor, if you want me to go, of course I'll go. You're my doctor." So they were really smart in calling that physician and employing them as part of their process to, if it was going to be a refusal, at least they could say, "We're talking to the doctor and he was translating for the patient and he knows the patient and he couldn't convince them to go." So, that looks like a pretty trusted source, right? If you're going to try to defend yourself later on, that if that person couldn't do it and didn't have the abilities, then, what else can you do? Okay.
Let me ask you about body cameras in EMS. Do you think that's coming our way, and how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it's probably coming our way like so many other things. To be honest, I don't know how I feel about it. Depends on which me you ask. The QA me, I say, sure. The more data, the more we can visualize what's going on, the more we can help providers to perform better. But in the wrong hands, especially where a lot of CQI programs are punitive in nature, or at least perceived to be punitive in nature, you don't want to give more evidence to those guys to really kind of hang you out to dry. So the paramedic part of me worries a little bit, because we all know that people say things in the spur of the moment in the middle of a call that, you don't necessarily want memorialized in audio and video. So I think it's happening. There are a couple of agencies that I'm aware of in the middle part of the country who are looking to field test body cams. And I think it could be beneficial in some regard, but we got to be really careful with them, just like with the police officers. Look how much help and harm it's done for them. It's helped exonerate people of bad accusations, but it also looks poorly if they're not doing the right thing or if they accidentally. And that's the issue, is that nobody's perfect, and we're working in a highly dynamic environment. Everything is not going to go the way the protocol says and the textbook says it should go. That needs to be understood, but we're in such a litigious world that people are going to look at that and just say, "Oh, here's the proof that you screwed up that call. Or you didn't do everything the way you're supposed to, or, you didn't use aseptic technique when you started that IV." And, so I'm fearful that it's going to be used in a nitpicky, just get people in trouble sort of way. However, I think it also could have tremendous benefits from a legitimate CQI process, as well as training to help people. And even your defense, if something does get challenged, video looks much more thorough than just audio or just using a PCR trying to describe the scene. So I think it can be very helpful, but it needs to be implemented in a very careful way.
Right. And I know there was a case recently from our neck of the woods where the paramedic had written in his run report and made statements on the stand about hearing certain things uttered by the defendant. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, I think it was the body cam of the police officer and even a dash cam that just proved that it didn't happen. And
Yeah.
that paramedic looks so uncredible after that.
Yep,
Gosh.
yep.
Yeah.
The thing is, you're already on body cam. It just happens to be from the police officer viewing you as opposed to being on you, viewing something else. So,
Yeah.
as I said earlier, always assume you're being recorded on camera. And that's your safest bet to ensuring that you be careful, do and say the right things if you just assume it, as opposed to being surprised later on when you find out, hey, guess what? Oh, you were recorded.
Yeah. Any final thoughts here about refusals that we should be aware of as providers?
I think we covered a lot of ground here, but I think, providers need to just adjust their thought process that this can be a perilous endeavor. So be very, very careful with this. You probably should give it more credibility than you typically do, and maybe even more credibility in terms of how you execute it and document it than even a transport in some cases, because the risk is so much higher. So not to say that you shouldn't do well on a transport, but yeah, be careful. Make sure you do a good, thorough exam on each patient, document that, make sure you establish competency. Some of those things go a long way in terms of your defense, because, we don't want it to be your demise. So take care, be careful, and pay attention in class when you take those classes on refusal documentation, because they actually are legitimate issues and concerns that are presented in those classes that people sometimes tend to ignore when they get out in the field.
Right. Absolutely. I agree. Paul, thank you so much for joining me today. Appreciate you doing this.
Thank you for having me, Jason. Yeah, it was fun. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to In Service, the EMS podcast, where frontline experience meets leadership insight. If you have found value in this conversation, please like, subscribe, share, and leave a comment. You will find links in the episode notes.